What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 4040 Vision podcast, the ultimate sports history pod brought to you by Sideline Sports. I'm your host, Khalid Abdallah, and I'm joined by my co-host, Salman Huck, and a special guest, Brian Peacock from the Locked On 49ers podcast. So Brian is a full-time podcaster and broadcaster. He's the host of the Locked On 49ers podcast and the Peacock and Williamson Daily NFL podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. So Brian joined us to talk about his beloved 49ers, the NFL as a whole, some big what-ifs when it comes to both the 49ers and the NFL. Did a lot of Trey Lance talk and, of course, some food talk to wrap things up. So you can find Brian on Twitter at BD Peacock, and you can find his podcast on all the major podcasting networks. So it was a great conversation. It was a lot of fun. And we recorded this on October 25th. So just after the 49ers dropped a big one to the Kansas City Chiefs. So let's jump right into that conversation with Brian. Hey, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today on the 4040 Vision podcast. How you doing today, man?
Doing fantastic. Yeah. Pumped for another crazy week of NFL football. I was just talking on the Locked On 49ers podcast about how if you think you know what's going on in the NFL, wait a week because you're going to be very surprised.
Yeah, exactly. I had that same thought a lot last night, especially watching the Bears and the Patriots, and then, of course, a couple other big surprises we had this weekend. So today we want to talk, of course, about the Niners, the NFL, but we also want to talk about you. And, you know, how did your love for sports start? Was it from your dad, your family members, and how did you become such a big 49ers fan?
Yeah, I grew up in the town of Visalia, California, Central California, and it's really split between sort of LA, San Francisco sports. My wife actually is a Dodgers fan, and she grew up there as well. I'm a Giants fan. My family's been, San Francisco fans. So for me, it's San Francisco Giants and 49ers, and it was growing up. And I don't know, I just fell in love with sports when I was younger. Loved playing sports, started playing, soccer and then Little League baseball and every sport you could imagine, some football and basketball. And it was just, from the start. And I think part of it too, being a kid and like the first teams I can remember were those late 80s, San Francisco Giants in 89 go to the World Series. The 49ers are the best team ever, going back-to-back Super Bowls in 88 and 89, and Jerry Rice and Joe Montana and Ronnie Lott and, Roger Craig. How could you not fall in love with those football teams? Like, those are the teams that my family was rooting for. We're watching those games. I was like, oh, this is awesome because my teams are in the Super Bowl and in the World Series every year, right? And then you kind of go and find out it's not always going to be that way. But those were very easy teams to fall in love with in 1989.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a pretty great time to be not just a Bay Area sports fan, but specifically a San Francisco sports fan. You got spoiled early on, just like these Patriots fans and stuff like that, all these young kids.
It's funny. The Patriots fans are all like, oh, Bailey Zappe's probably going to be amazing because we've seen it before, right? Like a 6th round pick becomes the best quarterback of all time. Bailey Zappe, 5th rounder, is probably going to become that amazing. And then you might be a little skewed and you realize, oh, yeah, you know what? That's only happened one time ever and will probably never happen again. So Bailey Zappe, sorry, Patriots fans, he's not going to be the next Tom Brady.
Yeah, exactly. So how did this love for sports translate into your career as a broadcaster and a podcaster?
So my career in sports media was sort of a backdoor thing. It wasn't a planned career path for me at all. Like a lot of people grow up that love sports. You watch ESPN and like, hey, I'm gonna be on ESPN someday or something. That'd be fun to be an anchor because they're having fun. They were cool and hip, in the 90s or whatever. But for me, it was the audio side first because I was a musician as well, played a lot of bands when I was younger. And I ended up going to broadcasting school, San Francisco State. Shout out to the Becca program. And originally I just wanted to record music. That was what I wanted to do. So I was, taking the audio path and then, dabbled around in the college radio realm, and that was fun. Then ended up getting a job. My first job out of college was in radio at KNBR, KFOG, The Bone in San Francisco. They're Cumulus. They're all part of the same company. I was kind of on the FM side at first for the first year. Then I was like, well, KNBR. This is awesome. I want to go work at KNBR. So I kind of started working at KNBR behind the glass and pushing buttons and producing and doing those types of things. And then eventually I realized that the path to, if I wanted to be an on-air person, the path to do it wasn't there. The path was, it's funny, I had to leave KNBR to get on the air at KNBR. And now I'm like a weekly guest there. I'm on the air a lot with them as a guest. And I don't know if I would have ever gotten there if I would have just stayed, because there was no path really for growth into that sort of a role there. And so what I ended up doing is, I was like kind of bartending at the same time and doing other things. And then I started working at a place called Total Traffic Network, reporting on traffic and doing sports and traffic and news type updates. And then this, the podcasting thing continued to grow. And I remember when I was in college and I was doing, we were podcasting our college radio program. We had I did a sports show. I did a sort of a rock and roll music show as well. And we would podcast, and it was on a format called Podomatic. And, even our professors, our instructors, they didn't know what podcasting was. We actually did a presentation about what podcasting was, because our professor saw us doing podcasting. He was like, can you tell the class what this thing even is? So I've been doing it for a long time. And never thought in a million years that podcasting would be something that would be a main gig. But when I was at Total Traffic, and, reporting on traffic and doing all that stuff, and, I called it being a traffic monkey, because you're on 5 different stations with 5 different aliases. My middle name's Dean. So I'd be Brian Peacock on this station. I'd be Brian Dean over here. Then actually shout out to both San Francisco Giants manager and San Francisco 49ers running back Roger Craig. One of my aliases on the air was Craig Rogers. So if you ever heard someone named Craig Rogers telling you the traffic in the San Francisco Bay Area, that was me too. So I would have 3 or 4 different aliases doing all these different stations and all these different markets at the same time. And was doing a podcast on the side called Gold Faithfuls, a 49ers pod, with my guy, Nick Winkler, who jumps on Locked On 49ers with me weekly. And then the Locked On Podcast Network thing popped up, and I saw this and I was like, daily podcast. I want to do a podcast every day, but maybe there's some money in it. Let's see where this goes. And I reached out to David Locke, and there was an opening for the 49ers show. He listened to Gold Faithful. He liked it. And we talked a little bit, and I ended up getting the Locked On 49ers gig. I think my first paycheck for Locked On 49ers was $12 or something like that. But it was more than I made my other podcasts, because those were just for fun and you're doing it once a week, Mm-hmm. And I was doing it every day. And it was a little daunting at first. It's like, man, a daily podcast? And I started in January. I started basically the same day that Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch were hired. That was right when I started doing Locked On 49ers. So it was the beginning of the offseason. It was January. Like, I'm going to do a daily podcast in the offseason. Like, I'm into the draft. I geek out on the draft, so that's kind of fun. But man, June, I'm going to do a daily podcast every day is what you're
it gets slow. June, July.
And, yeah. But man, the NFL, like I just said, man, the NFL's so fun. The storylines never stop. It's been even more that way the last couple of years with the way the 49ers have gone and throughout the offseason. So we just kind of been plugging along, and it's been amazing to see the growth. And eventually my podcast became my main gig. And it was like, man, I got to go all in on this and get another daily podcast. And I do the Peacock and Williamson NFL show daily, talk about the entire leagues. I do 2 daily podcasts now, and that's my main gig. And now I've got other side gigs. So it's pretty amazing to see how the podcast thing went from being hobby to side gig to main gig, and where we're at now with podcasts, which is pretty much the only media that's growing at this point.
Yeah, that's incredible. You're like a podcasting OG. I remember back in the day, we had to download podcasts onto an iPod from iTunes.
That's the name, right? Yeah, you have to download everything, and then you had it there while you
exactly on my little iPod, not an iPod Touch, the one before that, whatever it might have been. So
amazing.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, Brian. I remember when I discovered you on the Locked On Network. I didn't even know what the Locked On Network was at that time, and I started listening to you and the Locked On 49ers. I was like, man, this is great. Every day I get to hear about the Niners. Makes my daily commute really good. So let's talk Niners with you, Brian. Tell us, what's your favorite 49er moment in the last 20 years as a fan? What was your favorite moment?
20 years. Okay, so we're not able to go back to the Super Bowl. It's been a long time, man, since the
it's been a long time.
I remember like dynastic days. I remember dynasty 49ers, and it's amazing how long that's been since the 49ers were that. And there were some really down years. I think the single moment that I got most just physically excited about, it wasn't the most important moment at all for the 49ers. But do you remember the Garrison Hurst run against the Jets?
Yes.
I think it was 1998, week 1, game winning. touchdown run. That was like the one where you get up off the couch. I ran out the front door and like yelled and scared my neighbors. That was like the moment I can remember being the most excited about just one big play. That play, I don't know why. And there's been so much, there's been Super Bowls, there's been playoff games, and that was week 1. But that play just got me so jacked up. So I'm gonna go a little off the radar with that one and see if any fans out there remember that Garrison Hirsch one.
No, that was a great play. I remember that. You're just like week 1, you bust out a 98-yard run. You're like, oh my God. And like, it was just an electric play. So that's a good one, Brian. Let's talk a little bit more on the current Niners. What do you think about the Niners in terms of, what do they need to improve on to get to the Super Bowl? Like I know there's been a lot of issues with the team this year, but what are your thoughts in terms of what needs to be done to make a Super Bowl run here?
They got to clean things up. That's number one. You aren't going to be one of the best teams in the NFL. I mean, as witnessed by the Bill Walsh 49ers and then later by the Bill Belichick New England Patriots. You don't win Super Bowls when you are one of the most penalized teams in the NFL, when you're one of the most injured teams in the NFL, when you lead the league in drop percentage, So, and everyone wants to, when things go bad, everyone wants to point fingers to the coach and quarterback. And it's true with the 49ers, and especially with the way things have gone and people picking sides with Trey versus Jimmy. Anytime the 49ers are bad, they're going to point the first finger at Jimmy Garoppolo. Then they're going to say Kyle Shanahan's bad. Now a lot of people want Kyle Shanahan fired, and Kyle Shanahan's probably his Q rating right now is the lowest it's been in the 6 years since he's been head coach of the 49ers after a big loss like that. But Kyle Shanahan's plays will look a lot better. Jimmy Garoppolo's throws will look a lot better if the guys on the other end catch it. If guys stay home on the defensive line during misdirection and don't let Nicole Hardman look like Deebo Samuel all of a sudden. So I would say it's very much the little things first that the 49ers have to worry about more so than who they're trading for. And obviously you got to get your guys healthy and back on the field. Bosa, especially Trent Williams and Mooney Ward last week were not 100%. I don't know if they even should have been on the field necessarily. Were they that still hurt? And you're trying to get your horses back on the field, but those guys need to be fully healthy and on the field to make the impact that they can make. And I think the talent stuff is totally fine. I think Jimmy, we've seen that he can win. And I thought a couple of weeks ago he played actually really good, and he was let down by some drops. So I think the first thing is, and there's not going to be another quarterback coming in, so you got to win Jimmy if you want to win, right? And they're not going to fire Kyle Shanahan. And if they did, what would that even do, right? How are you going to get better, especially now during mid-season with that? So Kyle Shanahan's play calls will look better, but it's also on coaching. It's not just play calling for Kyle. It's you got to coach up those players with drops and technique and your assignments and penalties like those. That is still on Kyle because it's a coaching point, but it's not so much about the plays that Kyle is calling, and it's not so much about just the quarterback, Jimmy Garoppolo. I think Kyle and Jimmy are the scapegoats and do deserve some blame for some of the losses this season for the 49ers, but I think there's a lot else that needs to go better, and they got to go back to the drawing board with the little things and not shoot themselves in the foot so that talent can play out on the field. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you. I don't see the Niners firing Kyle Shanahan unless, something goes horribly wrong, but we'll stay positive. We'll say, what if he wins the lotto next week or something, decides to hang it up and go hang out on the beach somewhere. So if the Kyle Shanahan era was to end after this year, after we said specifically 6 years, what do you think is the legacy of the Kyle Shanahan era?
Oh man, that's a tough one. I would say maybe unfairly he would get lumped into the Norv Turner sort of category of good offensive coordinator, play caller, but once he was the head guy, he didn't have something that it took to be that dude. And I think that would be unfair because I think Kyle Shanahan is a pretty good head coach. And I think a lot of it is maybe Kyle Shanahan's own fault that he doesn't have somebody else do some things for him. You know what I mean? And I think we're starting to see it with losing so many assistant coaches too. And just, I'm sure his work week is just different now because it used to be a certain way and he knew exactly how it was going to go with Mike McDaniel. And and Mike McDaniel was a smart guy, and he's doing a good job with the Miami Dolphins. I don't think it's so much that, he was the real genius behind it, and he was drawing up the plays, and Kyle was just calling them. I think it's more like, man, he was breaking down film this way during the week, and this is how they had it structured. And he was with him for 14 years, and he made things so easy on him, and they knew the structure of things. But it's got a new quarterbacks coach, new tight ends coach, new special teams coordinator, new wide receivers coach. I don't know if I said that already. And there's just so much changeover with the coaching staff. So I'm sure just week to week, everything's different for Kyle Shanahan. And they're still trying to figure out some of that stuff too. So I would say it's little things that really is key. And Kyle Shanahan maybe could be helped with more of an administrative person that helps him, and maybe take a step away from the draft a little bit more. The scouting department knows what they're doing. They're plucking these starters out of the 5th round, let them, don't get too silly about making John Lynch go trade up for your dudes anymore. Let them do their job. You do your job, take it off your plate too, make things easier on you. And I think Kyle can then focus more on the play calling, and I think everyone will get better.
Yeah, I think that's one of the prices of success is the brain drain that happens for your top assistants, your top guys. And you mentioned Mike McDaniel, Robert Saleh is another one that's shown to be a more than competent head coach. So it's hard to replace these guys for sure.
No doubt. And I do want to say with Kyle Shanahan too, it's he's a pretty interesting guy, and I think he's sort of slow sometimes to realize what changes he needs to make, but he ends up making them. Last year, the 49ers were even in a worse spot than they are right now. They were 3-5. They're only 3-4 right now. And they went to the NFC Championship game, and all of a sudden, in the back half of the year, they were humming. So, it kind of takes some time, and I think he'll tinker and they'll figure some things out. And, Christian McCaffrey with Debo getting that thing going. Maybe they can't key as much on one side until have, maybe that'll open up half of the field, because they're really keying on Debo Samuel right now. When Christian McCaffrey's in there, maybe they can't do that. So that makes Debo better, and it opens things up for McCaffrey because they can't really key on one guy or the other in that short passing game. And that's where I do think Christian McCaffrey is going to make the difference for the 49ers, is in the short passing game, converting those third downs, because he's a good running back, but the 49ers are going to be fine with Elijah Mitchell running the football when he comes back. And we just saw that the Jeff Wilson out-carried Christian McCaffrey last week anyway, yards per carry. It's like the running game is not what's going to, do it for the 49ers. It's what McCaffrey gives you in the passing game. Does that open things up? And then we see, like post-bye, we see the 49ers go on this crazy run. That's absolutely something that could happen this year.
Absolutely. Brian, let's talk a little bit on the draft. You mentioned that and Shanahan stepping away, but I know you're big on, you do the Shadow 49ers, you try to draft in real time. In the last 10 years, if there was one first round pick you could change for the Niners, which one would you change?
Well, the AJ Jenkins in 2012 is the one, and that was sort of the catalyst to me, because I was like, people are calling Trent Baalke the draft ninja. That might be oversold a little bit. And then that 2012 draft was like, oh, this is silly. I think I could draft as good as Trent Baalke, and I'm actually going to do it, and I'm going to draft along, because there's a lot of hindsight with the draft, and that's what I don't like about it. Drafting is hard. Like my Shadow 49ers. The 49ers have crushed me in rounds 5 through 7. Like 49ers have done really good in the late rounds. It's the early rounds and some of the easier picks. I'm like, what are you guys doing? Why are you drafting third round dudes in the first round? What's going on right now? And so drafting is hard and it's difficult, and teams miss a lot, and good teams that draft really well miss a lot. So you have to remember that. And there's so much hindsight. Oh, this guy got drafted right after this guy. How didn't you take him? And I think what ends up happening is when you start drafting for need and you force yourself into some picks, it gets even worse, because then you're like, oh man, there's this really star player that was just better and who didn't fit your need, but needs change so fast in the NFL. You were going to need him next year anyway, most guys don't do much as rookies in the first place. But yeah, the AJ Jenkins draft, that was the one where I was like, all right, I can draft better than Trent Baalke. And it turns out.
And why do you think Shanahan misses so much on his guys? Like he hypes up these guys and says, these are my guys. But what do you think is the factor that he's missing out on that these guys don't turn out so successful?
I don't know. That's so hard, because he obviously knows what he wants, and he knows football, and he's gotten some right. They nailed the Debo pick.
Yep.
Bosa was kind of like that one's hard to, because you could only mess that pick up because everyone I think 32 teams would have taken Bosa right there.
Yeah, that's a no-brainer.
Including the Cardinals if they didn't have the first pick and Kyler Murray was already gone. And they nailed Fred Warner. The picks they've really hit on are guys that are wired a certain way. And the picks they've missed on were the picks where Kyle just saw a trait and was like, fell in love with it. Joe Williams and Dante Pettis. And, I think that's sort of, he gets sort of a I guess, because the draft, and this is what happens when I do the shadow draft too, is I get in a lot of arguments with 49ers fans because and it's just, this is nothing against anybody. This is the way fans are. As soon as the draft ends, you think you drafted 7 in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
That's the way fans feel. I'm like, I didn't really like this pick. I'm like, I think they know a little bit better than you do about this. And it's like, okay, sure, fine, whatever. But not all these guys are going to be great, right? And so it's not a one-person draft. And it's like, okay, maybe if you didn't trade up, you didn't get Dante Pettis. Maybe he does get taken by another team, but that's okay because there's still Michael Gallup and DJ Chark, and there's other players. Like, you don't have to have this laser focus and have these blinders on. It's like, I only see one prospect. We have to go get this one prospect, and we have to trade up for him. And it's like, rely on your scouting staff to be like, no, there's these other guys. Here are the grades for a reason. These guys have the same grade. If he's gone, maybe we miss out on him, but we've got this other guy too. And so I think that's where the 49ers have gone wrong. And I think it's a good relationship between Shanahan and Lynch because Lynch will go get the guys for Kyle. Whereas other GMs are like, okay, thank you, coach. We'll take that into advisement. Now I'm going to go draft the guys I'm going to draft. But Kyle's the head of the pyramid, right? So Kyle's like, I really like this guy. I'm not going to be able to go to sleep if we don't draft Joe Williams. Joe Williams wasn't even on the 49ers draft board. And then John Lynch calls him. What's that going to do? Of course, I don't know how many job interviews you guys have been on where you lie through your teeth, you do whatever you can to try to act.
Plenty.
You're dressed up. You're like, hey, I'm going to be the best employee you ever had, And so they end up drafting the 4th round, never plays a snap for the 49ers. They were right. The scouting staff had it right. He shouldn't have been on the draft board. And so Kyle gets sort of blinders when it comes to some prospects. And I think that's probably what's led to it, is not only that they weren't worthy of where they were drafted, but it was like the only player on the board that they had to go get.
Yeah, I think Bill Parcells used to say, if you're going to ask me to make dinner, you better let me buy the groceries. But a lot of coaches can't really handle that responsibility. It's a lot of work to be a head coach as it is. And then you're going to add, draft prospects and scouts and all, scouting and all that stuff. It's a lot on your plate.
Yeah. And then you're relying on, because that was really the greatness of Bill Walsh, because he was so good at both. And he knew how he was going to use a player. He knew what he was looking for. And he saw stuff in players that other people didn't see. And I think the idea that everybody in the building is amazing at evaluating is probably not correct, right? And so if your scouting staff's doing a really good job, you should be able to ask coaches what they see and have them look at some guys. But just because Chris Kosurik's like, I love Javon Kinlaw, it's like, that doesn't mean you have to draft him because your D-line coach loves him, right? Or because this coach loves him. And like Bobby Turner, the running backs coach, he doesn't get to pick first rounders, but he plucks undrafted free agents to 6th rounders like crazy, right? So maybe that's the guy you should lean on more than some other coaches. But I don't know. You have so many voices, and I think that's what's tough is there's too many voices. And yeah, Parcells, I love that quote. And then some coaches are just really bad and screw things up from scouting staffs, and some scouting staffs are bad. Maybe the coaches should be picking the players. So, and it's just difficult anyway. A guy can get hurt and break his leg. He would have been a Hall of Famer. You never hear from him again. Or maybe his head's just not screwed on straight. Or maybe you got a terrible coaching staff and you ruin a guy. And so there's so many different pitfalls for a draft prospect. So if you're hitting 50%, you're doing pretty darn good.
Yeah. And you talked about getting laser focused on a prospect and trading up for them. So of course the most high profile trade recently was the Trey Lance decision, trading up and giving up a lot of picks to pick him. So obviously we haven't seen much of him, probably a total of, a game and a half, 2 games worth of snaps in his career. But how confident are you on a scale of like 1 to 10 of Trey Lance as the future quarterback or the franchise quarterback for the Niners? I know it's hard to say, but
I mean, it's so hard because there's so little to go on. And Trey Lance was one of the most unique prospects really in my lifetime and in modern draft history, because nobody has ever been drafted that has only played 1 year of college football. And that year wasn't even the year before the draft. It was the year before that, right? It's never happened. Not a 7th rounder, not a 1st rounder, and definitely not someone you spent 3 first rounders to go draft at number 3 overall. So very unique. but you see what they loved in him. He's got size. He's got a great arm. He's athletic. He's really smart. It seems like he's wired the right way. So for all those reasons, especially the neck up reasons, you'd really want to bet that he's going to be good. But has he already been through it? Has it been too long? Like we're talking 3 years of football that he's missed out on. The other guys have, the craziest stat to me was Tom Brady. Like, so these are the players that, I mean, Tom Brady's obviously, greatest quarterback of all time. But that's one of the 32 quarterbacks in the league. That's one of the people you're going to be competing against if you're Trey Lance and you're the 49ers. Those are the quarterbacks that exist. Last season, Tom Brady led the league in pass attempts. He threw the ball 715 times or something crazy. He threw the ball a lot. That's more pass attempts than Trey Lance has had in his life. High school plus college plus NFL.
Wow.
And so he's behind 1 year of Tom Brady plus 20 more years of Tom Brady. That's how far behind Trey Lance is against his competition. So it's so hard. And we've even seen this week with Justin Fields. Everyone's calling him Bustin' Fields. He's looked bad, can't get the ball out in timing. But then you see that one throw. It's like, that's a special throw. That's a special run. He's got the talent. That's clear. And then he comes out, new game plan, and looks a lot better against Bill Belichick. The defensive genius couldn't stop the Bears offense. And so it takes some time. We've seen it with Jalen Hurts. We've seen it with Josh Allen. If you have the physical talent and you're built right upstairs, you got to want to bet on Trey Lance. And that's what the 49ers were betting on. If they made a mistake in the draft, it wasn't that who they decided to take at number 3. It was that they traded up, and that was the bad process. It was unnecessary to go up that high. And again, this is the argument I get into with fans when I say that. It was unnecessary to trade when they did. First of all, they hadn't finished their evaluations. And you should probably finish your evaluations and be really, 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 really sold on the guy and know exactly who it's going to be when you trade up, rather than, we want the opportunity to draft one of these 3 guys that maybe we'll like. Maybe we won't even end up liking them when we're done with our evaluations. You know what I mean? And so this is like, it's not a one player draft thing. And that's the argument I get into. People are like, well, Trey Lance wouldn't have made it to 12 if they didn't trade up. And my response to that is like, okay, so what? Like, I like Trey Lance. I think he's good, but that doesn't mean that's a good process to go up and get that player, because you still could have got Mac Jones. And I don't think they should have drafted Mac Jones, and they definitely, and now we know, it was like, you're going to trade up to number 3 for Mac Jones? Hell no. That's not happening. So it's got to be Justin Fields or Trey Lance. You got to at least have that upside in that number.
Yeah. If the question is, Trey Lance or Mac Jones plus 3 first-round picks, or Justin Fields plus 3 first-round picks, there's different calculus involved.
Right. Absolutely. And that's exactly it. And they miscalculated thinking that none of those guys were going to get there. And who knows, maybe Trey Lance still gets to 12 because of the reasons, the Parcells thing, going back to Parcells, his commandments for drafting a quarterback. Trey Lance hit, I think, 1 of 7 or something like that, because the Parcells commandments are, you want a quarterback to have gone through stuff, be more ready when he's there. It's, a certain amount of wins in college, a certain amount of years in college, all these, a certain amount of, completion percentage, all these other things. I think completion percentage might be the only one that Trey Lance hit of those things, because he only played that 1 year. And that's why a lot of teams still subscribe to that same thought process. So I'm sure a lot of teams love Trey Lance. I'm sure some teams didn't have him on their draft board as a first round prospect because of that. Because he's so unique as a prospect. So there's a lot of work he's got to do. He needs so many reps, and now he's missed out a whole season of reps. So even if he does achieve that, it might be an Alex Smith situation where we don't see it until year 8. Unfortunately, that's one of the outcomes. But I would bet on the young man because of his talent, and because it really seems like everything's not too big for him, which is usually the first pitfall for an NFL quarterback. They just can't handle the pressure. By the way, I know you guys wanted to talk today about what ifs, and I didn't put together a top 5 what ifs in the NFL, but one of the big ones is that not trading up. And do you guys remember who went number 12? The 49ers?
Micah Parsons.
Yeah, it got traded a couple times. Ended up with Dallas with Micah Parsons, who right now is the best player from that draft class. And the 49ers were sitting there where that guy got taken. So we're talking about what ifs and hindsight stuff. And I think a lot of people were evaluating Micah Parsons as an off-ball linebacker. So he probably wouldn't have been my selection there. But when you evaluate Micah Parsons as an edge guy, I mean, imagine Micah Parsons on the opposite side of Nick Bosa. So we're talking what ifs. if the 49ers didn't trade up and we're all in with Jimmy instead of, the pick would have been Mac Jones, I'm sure, for the 49ers if they didn't trade up. And they stayed at 12. But man, if you look at what Micah Parsons would be on the 49ers defense, he might be defensive player of the year this year. And then the 29th pick this year that the 49ers had, it got traded again multiple times to Miami, traded for Tyreek Hill. So how about matching Jimmy with Tyreek Hill on offense? And you got Micah Parsons on defense, and you still have another first-round pick next year if you were going all in with Jimmy G, which the 49ers ended up playing with Jimmy G now. So that's a big what if right there. It wouldn't have gone that way, I think, if the 49ers were in charge. The pick ended up after Kansas City got the pick, they traded up with New England, and New England took Cole Strange. Cole Strange would be a nice fit on the 49ers offensive line too, center, guard. So so that's a big what if right there. And who knows what the first round pick would be this next coming year for the 49ers. So that's the potential you're giving up when you're making a move like that, is that you better be right. And so we'll see how it ends up looking for the 49ers with Trey Lance.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Brian. I didn't understand why they traded up so far up to get Trey Lance, especially when the evaluations were not done. So definitely.
Even just like the simple, sorry to interrupt you, but just like the simplest, like if you just like look at it logically, okay, you're at pick 12. There's 5 quarterbacks you think are probably worthy of taking. It's like, okay, how about wait until pick 5?
Yeah.
I mean, is that insane to be like, well, and they would have, and clearly we know now that at least 2 of them and probably all 3 quarterbacks would have still been there. So now you're saving 1 full first round pick to move up to pick 5 or 6. And by the way, the Eagles did swap from 6 to 12. So, you could have got up to 6, even if you did it that day. And I'm sure the Dolphins at that point wouldn't have been like, no, because you have that in your back pocket knowing, hey, we're willing to spend all this. And the Dolphins aren't going to say no on draft day to that same trade they took. So the timing of it was really weird with that trade up. And maybe the evaluations, they finished like, man, we got to get Trey Lance. Then on draft day, you're saying, hey, Dolphins, here's all his picks. And the Dolphins are like, hell yes, we'll take that.
Yeah, absolutely. Showed their hand a little early there. I know you've been a big Richie James fan when he was on the Niners, Brian. Which 49er excites you on the current roster?
Yeah, Richie James, the first ever 49er that I had on Locked On 49ers.
Yes, I remember that.
Undrafted free agent. Who excites me right now? I want to make a big shout out to Aaron Banks, who changed his body, is a completely different player than I saw on tape in college and even last year. And even in camp, he was getting beat a lot. And I did not believe in him at all, even starting this year. But he's played really well for the 49ers offensive line. So I love those stories. And I love that and again, what makes the real difference in the NFL is how you're built from the neck up. And he put in the work clearly to become a different player than he was. And I thought that was going to be a bad draft pick. And I didn't think that was going to turn out as good as it's turned out so far this year. And so we'll see what Aaron Banks looks like throughout his career. So I love those sort of stories. Talanoa Hufanga too. With this. So those were my 2 things coming into the year. Like, are you guys sure at guard and at strong safety, you're going to roll with those guys and we're going to be cool there, huh? And they have been. And Hufanga is so fun to watch. And so I love those stories and prove me wrong, prove a lot of people wrong. So I'd probably start there with some of those guys. One of my favorites on the team, I'm sad he's gone now, was Raheem Mostert.
Yeah,
I loved his attitude. I loved hearing him post game and the whole surf thing. And he just was kind of like, I like when players surprise you a little bit. I think that's one of the things I like about Hufanga. He's not just like your standard dude who's like acts the same, talks the same, has the same answers all the time. I like the guys that surprise me a little bit, and I think Raheem Mostert was kind of like that, and I think Hufanga's like that now for the 49ers.
Yeah. Aaron Banks was surprisingly, he surprised people. I didn't think he'd be playing as well as he's been playing, so that's a good pick. And Hufanga is just a dynamic guy, so great picks there, Brian. Let's talk outside the Niners, Brian. What teams do you like in the NFL? What teams kind of excite you to watch? Like you're like, oh man, I got to watch these guys, and Super Bowl thoughts for you.
I think. You know what? I want to add one more real quick to your last question.
Yeah,
I have become so much a bigger fan of both Jimmy Garoppolo and Trey Lance, just because of the unfair insanity that some fans put on them, and that the organization really helped heap onto them because they created this weird situation with sort of a quarterback controversy the last 2 years, and everyone's picking a side, Jimmy or Trey, which I think is totally unfair. And, so half of the fans have been trashing one guy or the other, and it's made me really root for both of them. So I want to throw both the quarterbacks in there, and how they both handled it as pros and sort of rise above it. I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, they've both definitely been big time pros about it. And, surprisingly, Lance has handled it well and Jimmy's handled it pretty well too.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what was the other question?
Yeah. So talk to us about teams that, you're excited to watch besides the Niners, and any Super Bowl predictions you want to give us.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the Bears team because I liked Justin Fields so much coming out, and he was my shadow guy for the number 3 pick, just because I thought there was a tick more in his downfield accuracy and tick more athleticism, and just like the high upside of what Justin Fields was. And we've seen some of that hero ball in the NFL not work out, but then when you see it start to get a little bit better, and you get excited, maybe he has that year 3 that Hurts or Josh Allen has, and that's what you're hoping for with Trey Lance as well. And again, people who piled on him and you're a bust, and then see him having that really nice week last week. The Bears are an interesting team just because you watch how they're built, and it's like, okay, you didn't draft an offensive lineman or a wide receiver. George Pickens is out there for you, and you go Jaquan Brisker, you go defensive players, but their defense played really good and helped them win that game. Their running game's helping them win, and so you're like, okay, let's see this continue. And so they're a really interesting team from a team building perspective to see if they can come through it. And are they the next Buffalo Bills, or are they the next, what the Bears have been for the last 30 years, drafting another quarterback and have new coaches in another couple of years. So that's a fun one. And I'd say some ex 49ers coaches. I think the Jets and the Dolphins are probably 2 of the most fun and interesting teams in the NFL right now, and seeing the way that they are growing and developing, and so much talent on that Jets team. And now it's time for them to start winning some games, and they're starting to do a little bit. But you saw them trade for James Robinson because they don't want their young quarterback to have to win games. And so they don't want to put too much on him. So that was, I think, one of the big keys for them, making sure that they still had a running game after Breece Hall got hurt. And the Dolphins and McDaniel, and just watching Tua, who I've called in the past left-handed Jimmy Garoppolo, so elevate now under McDaniels and those weapons. And I think we're starting to see it's so important to have really good receiving weapons for your quarterbacks, right? We're just seeing that around the league, and with Tua and with Waddle and Tyreek, Tua is just taking off. So that's a really fun team right now.
Yeah. And what about Super Bowl, Brian? Who are you predicting midway through here?
I think I got to go Bills, Eagles. The Bills and the Chiefs, especially seeing how the Chiefs went through the 49ers this week. The Bills, Eagles, and Chiefs just look like they're on a different tier than everybody else. And in the AFC, I'd almost be shocked if it's not either the Bills or the Chiefs that make it. And I hope that's the AFC Championship game, because that'd be a whole heck of a lot of fun.
Yeah, that would be definitely a fun AFC Championship.
But the Niners are right there for that 4 seed. And even though they're 3-4 right now, if they fix up those details we talked about earlier in the pod, like the 49ers should be that team that's right there and
absolutely
definitely knock off the Eagles. But the Eagles are just playing so well right now.
Yeah, the Eagles look like a juggernaut right now, so we'll have to clean up some stuff to get there. Brian, give us some draft prospects to watch for the 2023 draft. Who are some guys you're looking at?
That is a better question for my co-host Eric Crocker, who hosts Locked On NFL Draft Show, because this is how it's been for me, especially the last couple of years since 4 years now since my son was born. Because I really geek out on the draft, but I don't like Saturdays is my day off. It's the only day I don't do any podcasts, and I cannot watch college football all day on Saturdays. My wife would kill me, and I want to spend with my son and get outside of the house a little bit more. So this is the new way I do it. Is the season is the season in college. I see some games, and really around bowl season, I really start paying attention, looking at the good teams more, and then wait for those fine folks that put all the time in to make cut-ups of all the prospects. And then January off season is really when I can watch a bunch of cut-ups during the week, and not just watch college football on Saturdays, and really watch more and more prospects and really pack them all into a small amount of time. And then I do a lot of work on the draft prospects. So right now I don't have a really good feel at all about the draft or some prospects. I will say that the quarterback class, everyone keeps talking about, next year's quarterback class really good, might be slightly overrated. And we're seeing like the struggles of the 2021 class that was generational, right? And so it's like, I would caution people to slow down when they're so eager to crown the next quarterback class as amazing. And I thought Justin Fields is a better prospect than CJ Stroud was at Ohio State, and people are ready to throw CJ Stroud number 1 overall. And it's like, Ohio State at some point, people are going to just stop drafting their quarterback. That's going to be the talking point probably for Stroud. Like, well, he went to Ohio State, and those guys all end up sucking because they got too much talent, and the competition isn't good enough, like the SEC against them or something. But yeah, Will Anderson. He's the guy, the pass rusher for the.
He might go number one overall.
He might go number one if depending on who. And I don't know if this quarterback class is going to end up being all that, and who ends up going number one there, and who has the pick. But still have a ton of work to do in the offseason. So that's a January through April project for the NFL draft.
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll circle back with you on that one then.
Yeah, and you mentioned, so I know we do talk a lot about what ifs on this podcast and the sports history pod. So you mentioned the Trey Lance trade and that being one of the what ifs. Is there one other, we can say maybe one 49ers what if and one overall NFL what if that really sticks out in your mind?
I would say with the 49ers what ifs, aside from that 2021 draft, which is the biggest one we've seen with the 49ers, and by the way, Christian McCaffrey too. Imagine like all those draft picks, how that would look different. I wonder who the 49ers would take. And it's kind of unfair to follow what the picks end up being because the 49ers would have made different picks than the teams that end up with those draft picks. But that's a lot of capital. 3 first, second, third, fourth, fifth. That's a whole team. That's a foundation for a team that the 49ers are betting on 2 players. So, that's definitely something to follow in future what ifs. But I would say I would go all the way back to Bill Walsh. Let's go back to those dynasty 49ers and Bill Walsh.
I love it.
Early, right? Like Bill Walsh retired after only 10 years. He was on top. What would that have looked like with Bill Walsh if he continued to be the coach of the team? Would they have beaten those Cowboys teams in the 90s and those Packers teams in the 90s? 49ers have more rings than any team in the NFL. Would they have had that 6th? Would they have gotten a 7th? Would they have gotten an 8th? You know what I mean? Like how much of a difference would Bill Walsh have made? And they were really good with Seifert immediately, but that sort of, I think it looked different than what it would have looked with Bill Walsh. So I think the number one is Bill Walsh stepping away a little bit early. And here's another what if for you with Bill Walsh. And this is sort of NFL related and 49ers related because Bill Walsh, remember, he came back and he was like GM of the 49ers for a while. And the Niners earned, was it the 2nd or 3rd pick in the draft in 2000, I want to say? And they ended up trading back. And that was the year that Washington took LeVar Arrington, Chris Samuel. I think Courtney Brown might have gone number 1 to Cleveland that year. So I think the 49ers traded the 3rd pick back. They ended up drafting, everyone thought they were going to take Chad Pennington, me included. They ended up drafting Julian Peterson, Ahmed Plummer, Jason Webster. It was a good draft. They drafted some good players that year after trading back. It was a classic Walsh, like we're trading back, we're collecting picks, and we're going to build this new team that is, kind of falling apart. But Bill Walsh, according to reports, really, really loved Drew Brees and loved him so much that he would have drafted him number 3 overall. But Drew Brees didn't come out early from Purdue, went back to school, came back the next year instead. So what if Drew Brees would have entered the draft early? 49ers would have drafted Drew Brees at number 3 overall. And what would that 49ers team look like the past 2 decades with Drew Brees at quarterback? Never would have drafted Alex Smith. So, he would have been a quarterback of a bad football team around him. So who knows if Drew Brees would have become Drew Brees. And it took him his second team to become Drew Brees.
Yeah, he was decent in San Diego. But this is the type of stuff that we absolutely love to just nerd out on. I think when we recorded our 49ers what if, we went back to the OJ trade as being one of the big what ifs for the team. But it's interesting you mentioned Bill Walsh and retiring early or hanging him up early. There's a lot of coaches that did that back then. I think it was maybe a harder job. They weren't traveling private and staying in nice hotels. We had like John Madden step down, Jimmy Johnson, I think Dick Vermeil, a lot of guys who would just get burnt out. So there's a theme there.
Like with Patrick Willis, right? And then Barry Sanders and some of these players, Calvin Johnson. Is it better for their legacy that they did quit early, quit on top? Because I don't want to see like old Barry Sanders that can't pull off a spin move anymore. Like remember Jerry Rice on the Seahawks? Like we didn't need to see that.
And the Broncos.
And I definitely wouldn't have wanted Jerry to retire at 30, but he could have retired at 40. He didn't have to hang on to 42. Like he had his cornrows, his receding hairline were like started in the middle of the back of his head. Like, the Raiders, Seahawks, Jerry, I don't think we need to see too much of that.
I mean, as a Raiders fan, I loved having him on the Raiders, and he was still great. He had a couple 1,000-yard seasons, I think, at like 39, 40 years old. So he's just like he's the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar of the NFL. He's just timeless, ageless wonder. All right, so before we go, let's switch gears for 1 second here. We like to talk about food on this podcast just as much as we like to talk about sports. So, you're getting ready to sit down for the game. What is your go-to meal? What are you ordering on, Uber Eats or DoorDash or whatever it might be?
Yeah, a lot of people ask me about like wings, and it's like especially if I'm watching the 49ers, I need to take notes. So I got to have my fingers clean. So there's no wings. Pizza with a fork, and I love myself some pizza, but if I got pizza, I gotta be able to type, so I can't have the greasy fingers. So if I'm going to do pizza and football, unless I'm just out somewhere watching it, then all bets are off. So I'm a big stew guy personally. I've never met a stew I don't like. Give me some gumbo. One of my favorite dishes that exists is chili verde. So give me chili verde, Mexican food. I love pozole too. Pozole verde is one of my favorite. But by the way, anybody in San Francisco, not the best, I don't know. My favorite dish in San Francisco, total comfort food, Porto Alegre, Mexican restaurant on Valencia Street, 16th in Valencia. Pozole verde. It's a huge bowl of green soup, chicken, bacon, just so much good stuff in it. It's amazing. That's usually my go-to if I'm really trying to cook up something for myself. It's a big pot of stew.
I love it. I love it. One tip: you can use voice to text. So if you got sauce all over your fingers, one tap on the phone, use a little voice to text.
You know what? I need that. I need that for driving. I need that for maybe eating wings and watching football, but I'm worried that maybe you get one word wrong and that changes the entire analysis of a game.
Very, very true. So you mentioned the podcast that you're on. So where can folks find you on social and find your podcast as well?
Yeah, at BD Peacock on Twitter. My Twitter was hacked actually for a while, and it was tough to get that back. Shout out to my podcast listeners are the ones that ended up getting me back, and not Twitter support, because folks that actually worked at Twitter listen to the podcast and they were like, this will not stand. Locked On 49ers, we're coming at you every day on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's on all your podcast feeds, YouTube, and also the Peacock and Williamson NFL show. Matt Williamson's former NFL scout, used to write for ESPN for a long time. Now he's doing stuff on radio and Pittsburgh and Steelers.com in the Pittsburgh area, and we break down the entire league every day. So coming at you twice a day on the Locked On Podcast Network.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. It was fun, fellas. Appreciate it.
Once again, big shout out, big thank you to Brian Peacock, host of the Locked On 49ers podcast and the Peacock and Williamson Daily NFL podcast. As Brian mentioned, you can find his work at BD Peacock on Twitter, and you can find both of his podcasts on all the major podcast platforms. Thanks for tuning in to the 4040 Vision podcast. You can find us on Facebook at the 4040 Vision podcast. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at 4040 Vision pod. And of course, make sure to follow, like, and subscribe to our podcast on all the major platforms, Spotify, Apple, Overcast, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks again for your time, y'all. Peace out.